Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batz, and you're listening to episode number 23 of the Future is Bright podcast. In today's episode, I spoke with Dan Binstock, partner at Garrison in Washington, D.C. We discussed why law partners leave their law firms. In our conversation, Dan shared his top core kind of 4 reasons why he sees partners move from one firm to the next, which include firm leadership, practice deficiency or support, compensation or profitability, and lack of confidence. We discuss those nuances in each of those areas and what partners should consider. Stay till the end to hear Dan's advice for acquiring law firms, as well as advice for law partners on the importance of due diligence when selecting a recruiter, and so much more. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes and YouTube. A bit more about Dan. Dan Binstock is a legal recruiter and co-owner at Garrison, where he focuses on partner and practice group placements. He is also the founder of lateralpartners.com, a comprehensive online guide for, you guessed it, lateral partners. Dan is a former president of the National Association of Legal Search Consultants. He is the current chair of its ethics committee and has been recognized as a top 100 global legal consultant for the past 7 years by Law Dragon. Outside of work, he is known as @PianoDadDan on social media. Dan received his undergrad in psychology from the University of Maryland and his JD from American University Washington College of Law. Welcome, Dan, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show. I am so glad that we were able to work out the bugs and make this work today, and in your busy schedule to have you on the show.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the topic that we're going to get straight into is, why do partners leave? You have a fantastic website with lots of great content, and I'd love for you to share from your experience, Dan, as you put it on your site, the 4 main reasons why partners leave. And we'll kind of just wax eloquent throughout those points and talk about key issues.
Sure. So the 4 reasons, I think, well, there's so many reasons that partners move, but if we had to boil it down to 4 of them, I think it comes down to people, practice in terms of their own particular practice, economics, compensation, things like that, profit margins. And then the 4th one is kind of a little bit more of the catch-all of their practice group and the firm overall. And number 2, practice deals more with their own practice, their clients, and things like that. So I know this kind of is a very broad umbrella that can encompass almost every situation, but it's a little bit of a framework on which a lot of other things tend to fall.
So let's just start with reason 1, people. I'd love to hear from you some of those reasons why partners use people as the reason to leave.
Yeah. So I believe that every problem, not every problem, but 90% of the problems that partners are facing boil down to people problems that are disguised as other things. So give me a couple of situations and I'll tell you where I think they ultimately come down to people issues at the end.
Right.
Except conflicts. That's not really a conflicts thing.
Okay.
I mean, that's not a people thing, but
Yeah, I mean, I think in today's situation, leadership is everything. So I would assume that's a people issue for partners leaving their firms.
exactly. They're not feeling connected with the leadership. The leadership will say one thing to the press and then say something different to the partners internally. I'm seeing that at more firms actually after what was going on last year with the AmLaw numbers dropping. Expectedly, certain firms have partners that are saying things to the media, and then they know that that's just not the case, and it's creating a sense of distrust within the partnership. And so that's a people thing in terms of the manner in which people lead, their way of making decisions, their level of transparency, collaborativeness. Sometimes it's too collaborative. Maybe it's too much of, an unbridled democracy in certain senses, and they want more strong types of leaders that will make more decisions and stick to those. So in leadership, it comes up a lot of ways, but even things that, billing rates. You may think that billing rates has nothing to do with people, but if you boil billing down rates, what's behind billing rates is these people have made the decision that this is the type of client we should go after, this is the type of work we should go after. And that's not aligned with who I am as practicing as an attorney. So these people are different from me. They see things differently than the way I see things. So a lot of it is that level of, are we aligned? And a lot of other things can really boil down to the sense of a lack of alignment.
So when I hear about alignment, I think of, and you use the word on your website, trust. That trust is so
Yep.
critical. Professional service firms, accounting firms, architect firms, consulting firms, uh, law firms, they are human capital organizations, and probably, if you would agree with me, they're incredibly fragile.
Yep.
And it sounds like leadership is everything, and trust. And you use the word, I think you use the word alignment, and that makes me think, Dan, of values. So there must be a misalignment of values, and people are ready to leave because of that.
Yes, it's I think values in one sense is what do you value? Doing things the right way. We believe in trust and transparency. Certain people can share the same values, but they may have different goals and outcomes, and that's where the lack of alignment comes in. Sometimes people can be very aligned on the goals, but they don't share the same values. And so that's where we see all of these little wrinkles develop where there's got to be the same alignment on where you're going and how you're going to get there. And if one of those isn't fitting, the wheel's not going to it's not going to roll smoothly.
And I can imagine, Dan, I mean, do you see these issues with management um, becoming more complex or more accentuated the larger the organization gets? Or do you see the same kind of issues for, say, a 100-person boutique versus a 1,000-person large law firm?
It the bigger it is, the more complex it gets. And what's made it harder is the focus on, we call it the Kirkland effect, which is, partners at certain firms want to be making as much as they can. They want their profits to be as uh, high as they can be, understandably. But we're seeing a lot of other Wall Street firms now having to compromise on their values and their alignment just to keep certain high earning partners with 20, 30, 40 million dollar practices for fear of losing them to a firm that's going to pay them 15 million as opposed to only 8 or 9. And that's a little bit of a rare circumstance, but we're seeing firms really having to decide who are they in the face of true capitalism in its rawest form becoming so uh, just so evident in ways that it keeps getting more and more every year.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating you use the word compromise on their values to keep those key partners. Um,
Yeah, it really is, and compromising on one with one partner who may be a particular rainmaker and who's developing all this business, and the firm is creating exceptions that can really hinder relationships with other partners in other ways that go far beyond just that one person because the firms make an exception for one partner and then 40 other partners are witnessing that. And what does that say? So these are kind of exceptional circumstances, but they happen more often than we may probably realize.
yeah. It, can I go a little bit further with you? Because I feel like leadership is just so important, and with organizations and um, driving the future of such a large entity as a large law firm, uh, when you see partners choosing to leave, is it typically because of one person driving a bunch of change, um, or is it more of something that infiltrates the entire executive committee? Um, have you noticed that say, hey, if we just get rid of X, or he's going to be here forever, so that nothing's going to ever change, or she, if I may?
So, you mean is the problem centered around a particular leader that's causing a lot of? Sometimes there's a sense that, I've talked to some senior leadership at certain firms where they've said, look, if we can't get rid of this person, we'll have some conversations in January. But if this person steps down and we're able to do some good succession planning, then we're going to, stay at it. So it's usually not one particular person. It tends to be something a little bit wider spread because whoever promoted this particular person, it tends to be symbolic of the larger culture. Um, but there are situations where there's just the wrong person was promoted. The partners think the person's blowing it, doing a very poor job, and it really comes down to getting rid of this person or the firm's going to, lose other people. And by the time that happens, it's usually pretty bad and everyone knows about it.
Yeah. And so even with that scenario you just described, it's not an immediate, like this is a couple year process of, oh, this person is clearly the wrong person in this role, and we're all getting this buy-in of we need to see change or we got to get out of here. So it's not going to be a
Yep.
3 month period. It's more like potentially 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I'd say one usually. I mean, if it's not going well, it depends when the person's term is up, but they may term them out early or change things up. But it is usually something that's a little bit of a longer process.
Yeah. Let's pivot to practice.
Yep.
Lots of things to talk about practice. Please, if you could tell me, what are some of the top complaints that partners grapple with when they're, 1 foot out the door and they're complaining about the practice they're at a part of?
Yeah, so it's tends to come down to a couple of different buckets depending on the firm. Sometimes it's rates where depending on the city, firms want or partners want more flexible rates. This has been going on for many years. That's nothing new. Um, Sometimes it is conflicts, which conflicts I think often comes down to a people problem as well. It may not look at it, but the firm has made a decision to prioritize this type of practice over that practice, so therefore these clients are going to get favorable treatment. Or there may be business conflicts that can come up, and as a result of that, the firm's decided that for a number of reasons we won't sue clients in this type of industry based on a number of other factors. So that really is a big thing. Conflicts as well. I think it's brand, it's the profile, whether other firms are really continuing to take over in certain areas and how that's affecting certain partners. I think it comes down to also resources. How many resources are those partners being able to get? Do they have to kick and scream and fight and claw in order to hire an associate? Is the firm trying to give them other associates from other practice groups that don't have any experience? Like during the beginning of the I don't want to call it a recession, but pullback of the market, we had some partners who are really busy and they wanted to hire people, but the firms just said, we've got all these extra corporate associates. We need you to hire them for your international trade practice. And it's crazy. You can't take a commercial litigator and put them in export control. And just using as an example here, but that's the type of thing that will really frustrate partners is not getting the support for their practice, not being able to hire appropriately, getting a lot of pullback and pushback. So those tend to be, if the quality of the associates are not quite as high, they may think that going to a firm with a bit of a stronger a brand will help them enhance the quality. So all of these different things are kind of intertwined and take on different factors of strength at different times.
Yeah, I have had partners approach me because their firms are phasing out their practice areas, no longer supporting, hey, this is this ancillary practice that the key senior partner is retiring and there's one guy inheriting his practice and the firm doesn't want anything to do with it. Even though the bill rate is high and the competing firms are like 30-40% higher. Um,
Yeah.
and that seems to be a trend as well. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, we're definitely seeing that, especially certain practices that are a little bit more rate sensitive, where we've seen over the past couple of years as profits have gone up so much with certain firms, they're all we've got 50 firms. Well, yeah, we've got about 50 firms jockeying to be in the top 30 of the AM law, and we've got 30 firms jockeying to be in the top 20. And then we've got 20 jockeying to be in the top 10. So everyone's trying to raise their rates, go to the most profitable practice areas, cut out the practices that are not as profitable, that aren't going to support, the 4.1 million profits per partner. And that's why we'll see, continued growth in these sort of larger middle firms because, there can only be so much at that high level. So firms are going to have to make a decision as to how much they're willing to cut off in terms of certain practice areas that aren't going to keep, because profits can't just keep rising and rising at the rate that they've been going over the past few years. So it's going to create an inherent tension.
yeah. I just happened to notice a little comment here from Gary Miles. Um,
Okay. Hey, Gary.
it, along with that need for support for your practice is being able to keep those attorneys without being poached by those competing law firms.
Oh, yeah.
Um, Definitely, that was a feeding frenzy the past couple of years, particularly in the corporate practice areas. And certainly,
Yes.
we saw some firms doing a better job of that than others. Anything noteworthy to bring up?
Yeah, we placed a partner this year for that exact reason. He just said, I'm training people, I'm getting them up to speed, and then they're getting poached, and the firm's not doing X, Y, Z to keep them, and I can't keep going through this, so I got to move, and that's what made them receptive was actually losing a second associate. So it's a very real issue.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Gary. 100%.
And anybody else that wants to post in comments or questions, feel free to do so. Dan and I will keep an eye out, do our best to try to address. Thank you all for joining us and the technical difficulties we had so far.
Yes.
Dan, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room,
Yep.
compensation and profitability. Um, so going back to like compromising of values and just the outrageous increases in comp that firms are throwing at partners, um, are you seeing some of those comps justified, or are partners just racing after the dollar?
You mean in terms of justified in what way?
Just the outrageous ceiling on comp that just keeps on being increased.
I mean, I think it makes sense if someone's bringing such, a book that justifies it. I think it's justified. We've seen a lot of firms having to adopt their compensation structures to allow sort of these super tiers, super levels. More for the lockstep firms have gone to these much higher tiers or bonus pools and things like that. So I think it's going to have to happen. Um, and some numbers are just ridiculous, like things that I'm seeing sometimes it's just bonkers that I don't know how it ultimately makes sense, but firms have really smart people running the
Yeah.
numbers to, the software that they're using. It's they're not going to do it if it doesn't make sense. The problem tends to come is that they become too convinced of what they think they want to happen, the new firms, as opposed to looking at the reality,
Yeah.
where I think that comes into the smart due diligence part, not on necessarily on the people themselves, part of that is the people themselves, but how they're analyzing the practice, the way that they're defining terms and things like that. So the compensation, if you look at someone who goes to a firm that gets paid a boatload of money and they've got a 2 or 3 year guarantee, that at the end it doesn't work out, oftentimes you can point back to something that happened during the interview process that would have raised flags, but people didn't want to see them. They ignored them, they brushed over, and they become so emotionally caught up with what is this going to mean if we get this person, but on the other hand, it's kind of not fair for firms because we tell them, be careful, make the right decisions. And then on the other hand, we say you can't sit around once you've got a good candidate. You got to jump on them. It's a competitive marketplace out there. You got to go after them if you take too long and sit on your hands. So the market is both praising good business decisions, and at the same time, they're both criticizing good business decisions. So firms are in a lose-lose situation a lot of times because they moved quickly to get someone to beat the other firms. And at the time, it seemed like a great thing to do. And then 3 years later, you find out, God, all these red flags came up, but we just didn't want to lose them. And the hardest thing is running a law firm. I would never want to run a law firm because you cannot win. You cannot not win. I mean, certain people like Neil Barr, Davis Polk, certain unicorn, brilliant people are able to do it, but most people, it's just there are too many forces against you to make it a winnable game. You just want to do as well as you can given the environment.
So I wanna come back to a couple of things that you said. I think, and I agree with you. I think for someone to truly successfully lead a law firm takes extraordinary gifts of people management and gut and courage and just extremely strong protected values to make something like this happen.
And it's also easier to lead a firm with top tier attorneys.
Yeah.
Like it's arguably easier to lead a firm that's got already a top tier practice and reputation that they're that they're surfing.
So you brought up the, oh crap, we hired someone and we gave them a 2 or 3 year guarantee and it didn't pan out. What were those red flags, or what maybe have you heard or seen that might have been red flags that firms can keep that in mind?
I think it comes down to partners overestimating whether a client is really dedicated to them,
Yeah.
or whether a client is dedicated to them and the firm.
Yeah.
And there's a very big difference, and partners don't know until they leave whether the client really likes them or whether the client likes them because they're at Kirkland. And we've seen a lot of partners who will leave a firm, say our firm's rates are going up so high, they've got me at 1560. If I can go down to 1,000, I'll be able to recoup X amount of work, and even that it'll be X millions per year, and it'll still work out well. We've heard that story so many times. Sometimes it works, but a lot of times what happens, say we want to pay 1,600 because that's our insurance, and if something goes wrong, we've hired that firm and we don't get the insurance with this other firm. So I think little things like that in terms of how many partners at a particular firm are touching a client. So if you've got a client that's mostly yours and you're mostly doing all of their work versus clients that have 7, 8, 9 different partners in different practice areas working with them. So that's a really important thing that firms need to look at in terms of the stickiness of the clients, what's the likelihood that they're going to port, how is origination defined, how is so collections defined, is it collections on what you've put in your system, versus what you've collected itself versus what's gone out the door and what you've collected on that. So a lot of terminology in the industry is really different. So certain firms are using different phrases to define similar or different things. And that's one reason why NAUS came up with the universal LPQ, was as a way to try to streamline terminology and nomenclature so that people were talking the same language. Because another example is certain firms will double count numbers for purposes of origination. So under one firm system, a partner's got a $10 million practice. On another firm system, they've got a $5 million practice. And if the firm doesn't ask that question and they lock in someone's comp based on 10 million, well, they're not going to be happy when they realize that the actual book of business is actually just 5 million.
Yeah.
So little things like that are really
Big.
Significant. Yeah.
They're big. So you dropped an acronym. Can you explain my audience what NAUSC is?
So NAUSC is the National Association of Legal Search Consultants. It's as far as I know, the only trade association committed to the legal recruiting industry for permanent attorney search firms. And there's the code of ethics that goes along with search firms that have to abide by the code. And if any of them violate the code of ethics, they can be brought up on ethical charges. So it kind of is a way to try to heighten the ethical behavior of recruiters, since there are a lot of excellent recruiters, and then there are, a lot of them that are just, you don't want them talking to anyone you care about.
Dan, I want to go back to something that, if it's compounded enough, if there's enough of this, it kind of creates a Dewey and LaBeouf to some degree. But like wishful thinking around guarantees. How much pressure are firms faced to give guarantees, and the multi-year guarantees? Because you get enough of those, and enough of those don't work out, you got a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. So after Dewey, a lot of firms really pulled back on that. What we see most of the time is stub plus one, which is, end of the current year plus the following year. Then after that, you just slot into
Right.
the system.
Yep.
Certain firms are being really aggressive, but those are the firms that tend to have the money to be aggressive with. And they're really sitting on a lot of extra cash as a result of really ridiculously strong corporate practices over the past few years. So that's why we're seeing some of the stronger firms get stronger, because they have the dry powder to be able to throw out people to guarantee, 3, 4-year, 5-year guarantees if they're really, really big players. And some other firms just aren't in a position to do that. That's why we're seeing kind of a sense of the stronger continue to get stronger and create a larger gap between sort of the top firms and the other ones that just can't compete. But most firms overall are not fans of doing anything more than stub plus one, unless they really need to get a group.
Yeah. Dan, are you seeing law firms borrow to make those deals work in acquiring partners?
I mean, borrowing from banks?
Sure.
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't see what happens behind the scenes in terms of whether they're, taking out lines of credit. It's an important question that we tend to ask when we're speaking to firms in terms of their lines of credit. If they do have a line of credit, if it's a short term, how often or how quickly are they paying it off? Is it something that gets paid off in a couple months, or are they taking until like the end of the next following year? So that's kind of what we tend to see. But after Dewey, a lot of firms and banks are super sensitive to overexposure on the credit side.
Getting back on point, I know that the final point of the 4 points is regarding lack of confidence. And I would love to hear from you. Where are you hearing concern about confidence in a firm or leadership or a practice group? Where are you hearing that lack of confidence?
I think one of the things that really gets under partner skin is when they see other people going to other firms that appear to be better and seeing that those other firms appear to have a quote together more than they do. And then they look at their existing leadership and then they start to romanticize how great it must be at the other firm. So and so went to Latham and Latham's got this great, leadership and all of these other things. So the grass becomes greener and then everything that happens in their own backyard starts to look uglier compared to how they've romanticized the other firm. So sometimes there are real problems. Sometimes it's the human condition.
Yeah.
And you and I, Chris, know this, that we kind of are wired, lawyers are wired to be a little bit dissatisfied because that's what's created this perfectionist tendency. So there are issues within firms, leadership issues, we've talked about. But I think some of that is just the sense of someone's going over there, we're missing out by sitting here, and we're going to miss out on the opportunity. So I think there's a big psychological factor, and certain recruiters really, I think, like to really like needle that point when they reach out to partners, and it's some may say it's sales. I think it's very borderline, just kind of manipulative persuasion. Don't miss out. Your firm's this, and you guys aren't going in the right direction. Sometimes that's the fire that needs to be lit in circumstances,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's just a lot of psychological warfare by certain recruiters to try to create agitation within partners who otherwise are doing pretty well and happy where they're at.
So I know that was your list of 4 reasons why. Then you have another list here of questionable reasons why. Without having to go through all of them, I would say, what are you hearing as the top kind of questionable reasons why partners are entertaining a move?
So the worst time to make a move is when you need to move. And if we think about on a scale of a 1 to 10, most partners decide to go into the market when they're at like an 8. And that's still pretty high.
Yeah.
And when the best time is, I don't want to say go in the market, but start to think about it, is if you're at a 6 or a 7 out of a 10 in terms of your dissatisfaction scale, 10 being I got to get out tomorrow, you don't want to wait till you're at an 8 or 9. And I think a lot of partners tend to wait until they're at an 8 or 9. They lose their leverage. They may be at a time where their practice is taking a dip. They're feeling more pressure. As their practice is taking a dip, the firm is pulling away some of their resources. And when you're at a lower point, things are bad internally with your current firm, and things are arguably worse off in the lateral market because you're not coming from a position of strength. So I think it's always better to, not confuse dating with marriage and consider some of the options when you rise to that 6 or 7 level, with the understanding that you may decide to stay at a 6 or 7, but it's better than waiting.
So let's go there, Dan. Let's talk about timing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, say, we have a partner who's a 6 or a 7. When should he or she, or what should he or she expect as far as timing in this process to have a conversation with a recruiter, to start exploring options? How should they think about that?
Well, they should always be proactive about choosing a recruiter, not just choosing the recruiter that happens to call them on a Thursday afternoon.
Yep.
Where they're in a bad mood.
Yep.
Or send them an email that says, X firm wants to talk to you. They can speak to the recruiter, but they've got to be really careful about protecting confidentialities. We know, but the process itself, we know partner moves can take anywhere from, a couple of weeks if you're really, really lucky and it's a firm that can move really quickly and they really want your practice and it's all hands on deck, or it can take over a year. And so it's a really long process. And sometimes when people wait until they're at an 8 or 9, they only have 3 months to move. and it's a bad situation.
So let's talk about some of the mistakes that partners have made in this process. You hint a little bit
Yeah.
to the first recruiter that gives them a call or sends them an email. How should partners evaluate recruiters? What kind of questions should they ask? What should they look for? Should they interview a couple of recruiters? How should they begin that process?
Yeah, well, the first thing is they should find out, what is your experience in my practice area? What is your experience in my potential geography? There's certain recruiters who focus on certain cities and that's all they do. There's certain recruiters who focus on, you know, the entire United States. There's certain people who focus on particular practice areas within the United States. There's certain people who do all practice areas within the whole United States and international. So you want to find out, it's like a surgery, who is going to be most applicable to what you need. And sometimes it doesn't matter how much someone does a particular practice area if they're calling you about a particular firm. So there's certain recruiters who have very strong relationships with certain firms, and they know that firm inside and out. It doesn't matter whether they're doing a search in Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston, DC, Atlanta. They know that firm, and that's really the most important thing. But if someone wants to do a more of a holistic view of the market, having a recruiter who tends to understand your practice area, your region of interest, and asking them those questions. How long have you been doing this? What's your experience in this practice area? What's your experience with the firms in this geography? Things like that. Do I have to work with you exclusively? Some recruiters will say, you have to work with me exclusively. Some partners will not be comfortable with that, some will. And so it's kind of common sense. If you were looking to get a surgeon to operate on your ankle, what are the questions you would ask? The same thing should apply to a recruiter, with the caveat that certain recruiters have really good, if you use the doctor analogy, there's certain doctors that have access to certain tools in order to perform the surgery. And they can perform that surgery better if you need that particular tool. Even if they haven't done as many surgeries, they may have the most important tool that you need, which doesn't happen, thankfully, in the medical industry.
It's a good thing. Dan, let's talk about something that has happened from time to time. I've had it in my practice. I'm sure you've dealt with it, where a partner comes to you, but you're not the first recruiter he's talked with, or she, and they're kind of like, I need your help, but I already had somebody submit me. And you start taking an inventory and realizing they've been kind of submitted because they talked to one recruiter who grabbed that person's information, unfortunately, and plastered it all over.
Yeah, it's a shit show.
Yeah. So, what is the advice you would give candidates? Because unfortunately, there's no rule book besides maybe content you and I try to publish or the ABA tries to put out there.
Right.
But how can we help partners from getting used by recruiters versus empowered and served by recruiters?
It's really tough. It's a real issue in our industry, is that usually the most unethical, sketchy recruiters, and there are a couple people, when you start talking to firms, certain people's names come up over and over. They've been blocked by certain firms. I think, anyone listening here may know who we're talking about, but they're also the ones who spam partners the most and are really just playing the numbers and gambling. They send out hundreds and hundreds of emails a day.
Yeah.
And they get 3 suckers. They submit one of them or 2 of them a day, and then they just play the numbers, and they end up making a lot of money by just do a real shoddy job. So there's been a poor job of educating attorneys about recruiters and what to be careful of and what to be aware of.
So let's just go there. I'll be the candidate, you be the recruiter. Hey, Dan,
Okay.
I've got this practice, and it's great to meet you. I've never spoken with somebody like you before, and you kindly learned enough about me. What happens if you start sending my information and submit me to other firms? what does that, how does that affect me as the candidate?
So once I present you to a firm, if I disclose your name and your biography or resume, I'm going to be tagged as your recruiter for a period of either 6 or 12
Yep.
months, depending on the particular firm. So during that period, I am the only recruiter who can work with you in connection with that particular firm. Likewise, if another firm 3 months ago presented you to a firm and you authorized them to do that, that's a big deal. You have to have authorized them. If you authorize them to do that, I cannot assist you with that firm at this point. We'd have to wait until the time period ends.
So, Gary kindly posted a comment in here that I think is really smart, and is good counsel to candidates. I'm just going to repeat what Gary shared here. Candidates, so corporate law partners, corporate litigators, IP attorneys, if you're working in corporate law firms of any size, which is our audience focus for today, with the same level of due diligence that you put into a case or a deal, or a matter you're handling, give that same kind of scrutiny to a recruiter or recruiters that you decide to disclose very confidential information. There is a permission-based relationship with us, or it should be permission-based, and disclosure is everything. And so be very cautious, and make sure that you've established trusting relationship, because if a recruiter were to get your information and somehow receive permission in the slightest sense, and you have an off day and you're like, yeah, I've had a terrible day, take my resume, see if you can find me a home.
Find me something.
And unfortunately, that recruiter, not all of them, but some, will send it to 200 law firms or more. And what happens is, ironically, let's just compare it to real estate. Many times with realtors, you're signing some kind of exclusive relationship with a home realtor. In a recruiter relationship, there's usually never signatures, there's never contracts between us. It's all permission-based. But in reality, if a recruiter submits you, it's as if you signed on the dotted line and you're wed to that recruiter for 6 to 12 months. And some firms will take it further. And so you cannot work with anybody else, even if that recruiter is a deadbeat. So we want to drive this home because it's been very frustrating, and it's hard because we really want to help people. And some candidates with great books of business, great teams, entire offices, they get kind of screwed over by a recruiter who doesn't help.
Oh yeah, it's amazing how incredibly smart partners with $10+ million practices know nothing about the world of legal recruiting. I've had partners with $10+ million practices ask me, all right, how much do I have to pay you? They don't understand the very, very basics. And then you bring in some fast talking recruiters who are less than honest, and attorneys will assume that everyone's acting in good faith, but there's
Yeah.
so much money at stake that you get a lot of charlatans that can come in and really muck things up. So
Yeah.
you got to be really careful.
Yeah. And to be honest, there is a code of ethics for this industry. National Association
Yeah.
of Legal Search Consultants has it on their website.
Yeah. So if you want to see if someone needs to at least abide by or be subject to a code of ethics that requires that they only submit your materials with your permission and things like that, kind of really threshold ethical issues, you should work with a recruiter who is a member of NALSC. And if you go to the NALSC.org website, you can see a directory there. Now, there are a lot of excellent recruiters who are not members of NALSC because for any number of reasons, they've chosen that they do not want to do it. So it doesn't mean that everyone who's a member of NALSC is automatically excellent, but they're responsible for abiding by a code. And if they don't abide by it, you have a cause of action against them.
Yeah. Dan, we've been giving advice to candidates in this process. There's a lot of other advice I'm sure we can provide them.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, we can come back to candidates, but let's talk about advice for firms acquiring, and maybe if there's time for firms that are losing partners that could keep them.
Yep.
Because in some cases, we'd hate to see some of our core clients lose partners. Um, and then, maybe there's time today for recruiter advice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two things here. So for the firms that are acquiring partners, where tend to see them making the most mistakes is that it's the restaurant metaphor is they have internally discussed what they think their strengths are. They hire an external consulting company that comes in and goes through the whole exercise and says you should do verticals based on your industry instead of practice groups, and they do that whole thing, and we can tell all the time. We go into meetings and they say we've just hired a consultant, and we've got this whole new strategic plan, let's roll it out for you, not realizing that they often sound very similar. But they've put this together, and then they will go out to the market and think that all of a sudden partners are going to just be so excited because this firm's decided to um, operate in practice groups. I'm sorry, practice in industry sectors, verticals, and they don't realize that what certain partners want are very different from what they think they may have to offer. And so it's kind of like going into a restaurant where they say come up to a table and the waiter waitress says, "Great news! We've just got new lobster. We've hired this company." Da, 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 and they start talking about the lobster, and then the person says, "I don't eat seafood. I'm allergic." And so a lot of firms approach lateral partner hiring that way, is they start selling without knowing what the lateral partner wants to buy. And so taking more time to understand really what the partner's drivers are is an often overlooked um, part of the process. Because lawyers are used to being advocates, and they take their case, they take their facts, and they start, even with us, they start kind of, arguing not arguing their case, but trying to persuade why it's a great place to be. And sometimes we'll just be blown away. We'll be like, wow, this sounds very different, but oftentimes it sounds alike. So that's an important thing, is to know what is going to be similar and what is going to be different. And there are only so many different ways you can differentiate among, 100, 200 different firms. But part of, I think, the most effective firm's approach is to take the time to understand what certain partners really want, and looking beyond just the first level question. So if you say to a partner, why do you want to move? Partner says, all right, I want to move because, compensation. Tell me why. What about the compensation? Well, I feel like we're not able to keep whatever, our profitability is lower. Okay, so how's that affecting you? Well, I could be earning more. Or is there a number that you have, like, where you feel like it would be fair? Like, you can really dig into what's behind that stuff if you don't just take answers at face
Yep.
value. And so that's where I think firms often don't really understand that process of very consultative discussions. They're so excited about selling. Here's what we are. Here's what we are. Let me show you our brochure, and this is a list of all the partners who have come to us.
You bring up a really important thing that can be addressed to all three audiences what we're talking about today, and four if you may, if you include the candidate themselves. But the acquiring firm digging deeper, the departing firm having an exit interview and digging deeper. Why are we losing you? Which may be obvious, may not be. The recruiter digging deeper instead of just face value.
Yeah,
And the candidate also understanding why are they wanting to move, being able to communicate that.
right. And sometimes candidates are looking for the wrong reasons. Sometimes candidates should not move. Maybe they're going through a midlife crisis and they're looking for a new job to create a new beginning because they're not happy in their personal life. And they think that changing their job is going to resolve the issues that are really about
Other
unhappiness
issues.
in a whatever reason. So before I became a recruiter, I was actually going to go back. I started going back to school to become a therapist. Um, and so I think one thing that makes my approach a little bit different, and it's not for everyone, is I tend to get really personal with candidates because I want to know them beyond just
Billable hour.
what's the billable hour. And so I want to know all of these other things. Why is money important to them? Is it that they have children going to college? Is it that the child's going to private school? They may have a child with special needs, and as a result of that, they need to pay for a private school. However, if they go from a firm that typically, requires partners to bill 14, 15 to 18 or 19, how's that going to impact their life if they now are earning more money, but they're losing less time with their child? So all of these things are very interrelated, and sometimes recruiters don't find out about what's really at the core of something until a partner says, I'm going to decline the offer. And you say, why? And they said, because I need to spend more time with my children and I don't want to do this, and my spouse doesn't want me to either, so I'm making this decision. And then the recruiters are like, oh, why didn't this ever come
Yeah.
up? And it's like, why didn't you ever take the time to really
That's
ask?
the question. Dan, just for the record, you'd make a fantastic therapist. Um,
Thank you.
but I'm sure.
What makes you say that, Chris? How do you feel about that?
I might have some personal history with you on that,
Yeah, yeah,
But how fortunate for partners or any candidate has a chance to chat with you and you're able to peel back that onion and get to the heart of the matter. I think that's awesome. And
thank you.
I absolutely agree. I mean,
And I'll say it's much easier said than done. Like a lot of times I'll look back on a deal and say, oh my God, I missed this. I didn't ask this. I was caught up in this and I overlooked that. And, so as much as I may say all of these things here that I'm saying are best practices, I implement them far less than I should
sure.
because we're all struggling to try to remember what to do here.
Yeah.
And it's a constant struggle for all of us to be able to put our best feet forward.
Yeah. I mean,
So by no means have I mastered this at all.
well, you are a fantastic teacher, if I get to brag about you. So, what we do is hard. I mean, what attorneys do is hard, but fortunately, you've put your 10,000 hours in, and you're a lot better than others. Let me bring up something that my colleague Denny just posted, and I absolutely agree with because it's so critical. The importance and even a way to evaluate a really good recruiter is he or she curious? So Denny said, remain curious, don't assume things, dig deeper is so important in working with the candidate and understanding those motivations.
Right. That's one of the benefits of working with certain recruiters who are not lawyers have an advantage because they know what they don't know and they're humble and they realize there's a whole world that I haven't been exposed to. I didn't work in a big firm. And so there's something really beautifully empowering about being curious and not assuming that you know everything just because, I fortunately, or unfortunately, I worked in a big firm. I did that whole thing, but I also see where that can be a hindrance because we think we know the answers
Yeah.
and we assume, and it's often not the case.
And that's interesting too, because then you deal with a lot of that group think that exists within firms if you're talking about some of the missteps that firms wrestle with as well, versus kind of digging deeper. Um,
Yeah.
Dan, as we kind of come to a close, do you have any kind of any summary thoughts or things you'd like to leave with my audience today?
Yeah, I think acknowledging and understanding that the lateral process is really hard. It's really messy. It's very emotional. It's there. It's almost a miracle when a deal goes through. It's kind of like, I equate it to those Rube Goldberg machines where, like a marble drops and spins down and then it hits and it spins around, then it drops the dominoes. Like by the time all those things happen, it's almost like, wow, how did that
Yeah.
happen? And a lot of times that's really in the lateral market now. When a deal goes through, it's kind of like that. So I think just kind of taking it easy on yourself, understanding that it's a hard process. And if you just think about doing good work and being honest and not bullshitting people, and this is for candidates too, like partners, just be honest with your recruiters. It it makes a challenging process that much more smooth and pleasant.
Is it worth it?
Is it worth it? Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't. But there's the hard way to do it, and there's the less hard way to do it. And if you're grounded in good values and kind of view this as more than just making money, but what is your purpose? Why are you doing this? A great book is Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I read that when I started recruiting, and I still make a lot of decisions, like why I'm speaking to you here today, talking about what some might say are kind of strategies or things that you may want to keep inside. Because I made a decision, part of my values is to share and connect with people, even if they're competitors. So I'm just sharing and giving it away because that's part of my purpose as a recruiter and a professional, is to give back to the community. And so part of the exercise of going through that book is you realize, who are you, more than just trying to make money, but what is the impact you want to have on the whole larger community? Because when we're done with our time on this little spinning rock, what impact do we want to have? And it's more than just how much is in the bank.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Dan, how can people find you, connect with you, contact you? What's the best way?
Sure, sure. So just Google me, Dan Binstock. Our company is going through a website change right now. The new website will be garrisonsearch.com. But if you just Google me, Dan Binstock. Also, if you're interested in the lateral partner process, check out lateralpartners.com, which is a resource of a bunch of blog posts, resources for the lateral partner process. And yeah, just the normal ways. And feel free to connect on LinkedIn.
So, Dan, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Of course, great chatting with you as always, Chris.